G'day ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Draw with Jazza. I'm Jazza and this video is a crash course on using colour in digital painting. The theme of this video was voted on and picked by you guys, and you can vote on my future tutorials by clicking the link on the screen now and in the description. And the things I discuss in this video can be applied of course to traditional painting, but they're going to be shown in the context of digital painting because the tools that you can use and the methods that you can use to create some of these outcomes are usually a little more streamlined and have a pretty direct approach that traditional mediums don't necessarily provide. And I'll also mention that as a crash course, it's going to be pretty condensed in the sections we cover. So along with each one, if you're looking for more detail and things to follow along with on that specific lesson, and this video might be a little too quick or not go in depth enough for you, I'll be providing links to other videos which will cover those themes, topics, and tools in much more detail. I'm using a program called Adobe Photoshop. It's an industry standard when it comes to digital painting. And the first thing we're going to talk about is the color picker. And if you come over here to the left and press our little double swatch thing, you can select your foreground color. Now the color picker has lots of different modes. This is the mode that I use, where you can change the hue by moving this slider around, this vertical slider, and you can change the saturation and lightness and darkness by selecting an area in the middle there. Those are basically the three parameters that all color pickers cover. The hue of the color, which is where you're changing between various colors like red or green or blue. The saturation, which is how much of that color is in the color until it goes from full color to a gray. And then of course the light and dark aspect. So you might have a very light purple or a very dark purple, and then of course if you want a desaturated dark purple, you move down there. So these are the other versions of the color picker, and it sort of just moves around the way it's presented. So for example, the vertical slider in this one, instead it changes the saturation, and the hue is horizontal along this large strip here. This is another color picker which does a similar thing, instead going from full saturation to darkness, and then light and desaturation is along here but still with that horizontal hue selection, and the list goes on. There are a whole bunch of different color pickers, some of which can be pretty confusing to be honest, and I tend to find that this is the one that works for me. The other way to select colors is with the eyedropper tool. So for example, if I wanted to select this orange, I can come over here and select the eyedropper and click. Ooh, there you go, I have a lovely orange. And then if I hit B or select the brush tool over here on the tools panel, I can then draw and paint with that brush. There are with most tools shortcuts, ways to do the things that that tool does quickly. Now the shortcut to the eyedropper is hitting I, where you can of course select and then hit B for the brush and paint that down. But even quicker, and I find extremely useful, is with the brush tool selected, you can just hold Alt and it will bring up your color picker for as long as you hold Alt. So I can simply hold Alt, click and let go, and then I have that. Alt, click, and then I have that and can paint that down. So that's a really fast way to color pick and paint. Now I'm going to mention two tools that can help you add a lot of dynamic elements to your painting. The first tool is a digital tablet. There are various brands of digital tablet. A digital tablet is an input device, and I'm using one here where you have a pen and you either draw on a pad or a screen, an LCD monitor, and this gives you a few more parameters under your control, one of which is pressure sensitivity, which allows me to have thin and thick lines varying based on how hard I press. And then the other aspect is pressure-based opacity. So if I press lighter, it's more transparent, and if I press harder, it becomes more solid. And I can turn on one and not the other. For example, I can have it really transparent but not change brush size as I paint. So that's the first thing I want to mention, and I highly recommend having a digital tablet if you're getting into digital painting. And if you're a hobbyist, there are budget versions you can get. You can get even on eBay secondhand Bamboo or Intuos Wacom tablets or something like that. The other thing I want to mention is custom brushes. Now Photoshop does come with various brushes, and if you right click when you have the brush tool selected, you can scroll down here and see a whole bunch of different brushes, but you can also get custom Photoshop brushes from other areas. And my personal favorite are brushes by the artist Kyle T. Webster, and he produces them on his website. You can Google them and look up his stuff, but basically I have all my brush presets and I have some favorites of his, and one of my favorites to paint with is Oil Lush, and you can see that it has a very different texture to the default Photoshop brush. So if I select my green here, I can paint it and I get this really interesting, nice sort of textured look. There are huge arrays of Photoshop brushes you can get, and this guy produces things like watercolors, and there are watercolor brushes of various styles and textures. You can even have ones that have sort of a wet look, and they overlay onto each other in very different ways to the normal brushes, which is really nice. I also highly recommend them for comic work. If you're doing much more cartoony or comic book style drawings, there are comic book brushes that are just way nicer to work with than the basic Photoshop brushes that Photoshop comes with. So that's our very basic introduction to selecting colors in digital painting and then using things that can create dynamic effects, like using a digital tablet or using custom brushes. There are also other paint programs that come with a huge array of custom brushes as well. If you're interested in learning more about custom brushes, there is a video now showing on the screen, which you can check out, and I explore that in a little more depth. Now let's take this crash course to the next level and do some painting. I have here a very simple sketch of a hand pose. I'm going to show you how I personally go about painting something like this. The first thing I do isn't jump straight into color or painting. It's often creating a foundation to work with, and in this case I would use something called a clipping mask. That is where basically I lay down a parameter of where I want to color. So if I hide my line work, you can see I've got this solid gray shape. The color you use doesn't matter, it's just the area that it takes up that matters, because the next thing I'm going to do is add a new layer on top of that, and then if I alt click on between that new layer and my clipping mask base layer, I can select any color I want and paint anywhere I want, and it will only paint within that clipping mask area, which is really, really useful. So this allows me to find a mid-tone for the skin color and then just paint over the whole thing very roughly, and it very easily covers the whole thing in a way that's neat and gets the base tone down. The best part of this is now I can add shading and highlights without worrying about messing up the parameter or going outside the lines or anything like that. The other cool thing is I can set it up on new layers and add clipping masks to the layer, again by alt clicking, and that adds the new layer to the clipping mask. But before I jump straight into all the other painting, I'm going to create a new layer outside of the clipping mask and create a palette. A palette is where I paint down the basic colors I plan on using. So that's my mid tone. I'm going to add a shadow tone, and when I add a shadow tone which is in a skin tone, I usually add a touch of red. So there's my shadow tone. Then to create my highlight, I'll go back to my mid tone and bring it up a bit and maybe add a touch of yellow. So that is my very simple palette. I've just got 3 colors to use. I'm going to go back inside my clipping mask, alt click to select my shadow tone, and then I very roughly paint down the areas that are going to be colored in shadow. Now the great thing about this is I can be really rough because I'm sort of figuring out where the shadows go, and it doesn't have to be very neat. Because once I'm fairly happy with it, then I do something called blending. And this is where I use my color picker by holding Alt, and I select a tone that's sort of between the shadow and between the mid-tone, and with it selected I can gently paint between the shadow area and the main area, and this sort of smooths things out, and it's a really nice way to soften that transition between our rough painted shadow areas and our original mid-tone. The great thing about blending is it allows us a lot of control. We can just simply alt click and push the colors around, maybe alt click, bring the shadows out in certain areas more, and it just allows us to create a nice smooth gradiented effect across our illustration or painting. Once I'm happy with my shadow tones, I add a new layer to my clipping mask, I alt click my highlight layer, and I place in some areas of highlights. Something to keep in mind about painting highlights and shadows is imperfection is key. We don't want to be too symmetrical, too neat or perfect. Sometimes that really nice soft brush look that's a little sporadic and a little haphazard can make the piece really beautiful and really organic. So there you go, that is a very rough example as to how I, with just 3 colors, my color picker and brush and a clipping mask, have been able to very quickly paint this hand. Now if you want to explore this painting style in more depth, there's a video I made that I'm linking to now on the screen and in the description, which you can check out, which goes into this advanced Photoshop painting method, but in a really simple, approachable way. Now moving right on to the next thing, another Photoshop painting method you may have seen from time to time is going from black and white to color. The advantage of doing this is it allows you to focus purely on the aesthetics of what what you're creating, the details of the piece and the lighting and the dramatic aspects of the piece without being distracted by getting the colors perfect. So for example, this is an orc character that I've painted, and as you can see, if I hide the white background, here's actually one simple piece. So I can create a clipping mask on this character in the same way that I created a clipping mask with that hand, and I can paint and it won't go outside the areas of this character. So using a clipping mask in this case is another really useful method. And what I can then do is with my brush tool, find a skin tone that I'm happy with. For example, being an orc, I'll make him green, and I can just paint in this skin area. Now, of course, this looks a bit ghastly because it's just a solid green color on what was already shaded. But now if you move over to your right in your layers section, there's this normal drop-down menu where you can see all these other different layer styles. So if you select that and move down, press the down arrow, you can scroll between different layer styles and you can see how it overlays onto the skin in different ways. The one I end up selecting tends to vary based on what I'm going for with each individual piece, but it's usually something like soft light or overlay or multiply. So I'm going to go with soft light for this layer style, and it's not going to be too extreme, and then I'm just going to continue to paint in these skin areas. Painting your images in black and white and then adding color can be a really fun way of adding drama to the later aspect of your image without feeling restricted in your initial painting process. Sometimes it can be a little bit too difficult to focus on and get the colors exactly right when you're also focused on getting the drama and the composition of the piece as good as you can get it. I'm continuing the same process through the entire painting of this piece, just selecting different colors and painting it on the same layer, all with the soft light layer overlay. So that's an example of a very simple application of color to a black and white painting, which, as you can see, is a pretty quick process and can produce nice results. The added advantage to doing it this way is if we're not happy with something, for example, this skin tone is a little too blue for my liking, I'm gonna go back to my normal color, and if I go select and I can go color range, I'm gonna eyedrop the green color, and I can move this scale, which will change the sensitivity of what it's going to select. And once I hit OK, it'll select most of that green. And then I can go image, adjustments, hue saturation, and I can change that hue. And if I want to see it in context, I can close that off and change the layer style to the one I want to see applied, and then go back to adjustments, hue saturation, and then see the whole thing in context as I move the slider around, which allows us to try even more extreme colors or other varying options. Another thing you may want to do to add variety to images that you do this with is add another layer, perhaps to your clipping mask if you're using one, and then use different colors and varying hues to add interest to your highlights or shadows. So for example, I've selected more of a yellowy tone of green. I've selected the overlay layer style, and that means I can simply just paint in the areas that I know that the highlight is hitting from, and this sort of just adds some color variation and adds some interest to the piece. And it's as simple as that, and I can do that to other areas of the piece as well to add some interest and color variation, and that's just a really quick, fun way to add interest to your piece. As you can see, painting from black and white to color can be a pretty simple and fun process as well. If you want to check out this method of painting in more detail, again, there's a link on the screen and in the description, so you can go check that out in more depth. The next thing I want to talk about is color overlays. So I have here another painting I did a while ago of Pudge from Dota 2 for anyone who is a fan, and I've just got 4 variations of the same version of Pudge, and I'm just bringing this up just so I can show you how I personally experiment with color overlays. So when I say color overlays, essentially I'm talking about painting solid colors or gradients on a layer above the original image and then playing around with layer styles. This for me is a bit of an improvisation process, and it can be really fun. It's like exploring and playing around until you find things that you think are really cool. So the piece we already have there has some interest and has some drama, but it can also be really fun to just do some really extreme things, maybe go into a really sort of rich red, and then I can simply select my layer option and scroll down and just see what comes up. And already you can see something like this adds a lot of drama. Obviously it's quite extreme, so you can lower the extremity of it by lowering the opacity slider on that layer. Another thing that's really fun to do is play around with gradients. So if I select two colors, with my gradient tool selected, I can drag and add a gradient to the layer and then play around with layer styles, and then we get a bit more of an interesting effect. We see a bit more of a transition in the lighting of the piece. And that makes something like this possible, where it just kind of adds a little more drama in that sense. And obviously, like before, it's quite extreme, but you can also do things like mix laying styles. So I might add a layer on top of that, and sometimes it's fun to just play with polar opposites. So if I place in a solid blue and then flick through the layer styles, sometimes it just contrasts in really interesting ways. So for example, with soft light, when that's put down, it shows this really cool mix of working with the blues and greens together, and you can work with the opacity to play with how strong that effect is as well. And then another thing you can do is play with some custom painting. So I might put in some orange and find a layer style that I find interesting. So let's say I find this rich orange interesting. I'll lower the opacity and I could add a layer on top, and let's go for something different. I'm going to go for purple, and with a really soft airbrush sort of brush, I'm going to paint in the lower areas of shading. And I'm just going to lightly airbrush some of these chunks, not going to be too careful with it. And then with that done, I can play around with the layer styles and see what sort of effects I come up with. Another great way to test it is if you paint a solid color, you can play with the layer styles first before you do any actual painting. And for example, in this layer style, I can see it adds a lot of really strong contrast. I could use this as an effect by then deleting what I've just painted, and then I can lower the opacity of the layer and use it in just some of the extreme lighting areas to add interest. And it's just a really cool way that you can play around with and get very different dramatic results. As you can tell, the original image is very different to all these variations, but it's just really fun to have the options and a really cool exploratory process you can go through. There's a video I made that goes into more detail in using overlays and layer styles to create lighting effects in your images, and you can click the link on the screen and in the description to go check that video out. The next thing I want to mention is talking about thinking differently. On these examples on the top right here, you can see the planet Namek from Dragon Ball Z and The Simpsons. The reason I'm using these as examples is planet Namek has a green sky and blue grass, polar opposites of course, but it works really well in the series and stands as a very definitive aesthetic style to the series. The Simpsons of course have their iconic yellow skin, and that hasn't really been done elsewhere, but it's so memorable and works so well that it's just an iconic aspect of the show. So they're examples as to how you can think outside the box and use colors in your setting or in your image in a different way that can work really well. And the other thing I wanted to mention in terms of thinking differently with colors are with these characters here, all of these people at the bottom have human skin, sort of a Caucasian skin tone, but they're all in very different light settings, and that means that their skin tones take on different colors. So for example, while this woman here may have some pretty standard skin tones in the standard light areas of her skin, if you go to any area that's hit by a certain tone of light, you can see that the color drastically changes. All of these examples share that in common. So they are standard skin tones wherever the light is more standard. But then of course, this is a much more purple tone. It starts to have more blues and reds in the tones. This one has almost entirely blue tones in the skin tones. This one has a mix of sort of skin tones with some red highlights and some more blue highlights with touches of purple on the other side. And then of course this one is a much more golden set of skin tones. So I mention all this simply to encourage you to keep it in mind, so that when you paint your skin tones, you might go ahead and paint your mid-tones as you normally would, but when you get to things like shadows and highlights, rather than just going a darker version of that skin tone, you might want to add a very drastic shade of a more purple tone. And you can see that the contrast between the original skin tone and whatever you add as the shadow can produce interesting results. Not everything will work. It's a process of experimentation and of course using references as well. And then of course you want to play with blending between these things so it's more of a seamless transition. And while this example is really quickly sketched up, you can get the idea that something can still look like a skin tone, but be much more interesting to look at visually if you're working with contrasting colors or varying light sources. The final thing I wanted to talk about is color manipulation, very briefly, just talking about once you have a final piece, it's not too late to change the colors if you need to in certain aspects. In this example, I'm going to leave the top left version to be completely normal. The easiest way to manipulate the color is to go through image and adjustments, and you can play with these settings. Brightness contrast is one of the most useful ones. It also increases the saturation if you have a high level of contrast. So if you add a lot of contrast to your piece, you may then want to go to image adjustments and hue saturation and bring the saturation down. You can of course go for some very extreme looks here by adding a lot of contrast, which can make a piece more dynamic or of course could detract from it. So use these tools carefully and just try and find the perfect balance for each of your images. You can also do things like mess with the curves of the image, which is basically detecting where the light and dark sort of change and exchange, and you can use different defaults like color negatives and see how they find different opposites and extremes in that process. And from the same menu subset, you can go to color balance and you can individually perhaps bring up the saturation of blues or turn them down and bring up the saturations of things like reds, which creates a bit more of a filtered look, and you can really play with that and get different results. And as you can see, the results you can get just from very quickly playing with that can be very drastic. So digital painting presents a huge array of tools and things that you can have at your disposal to very quickly, drastically change your digital paintings. But aside from that, it also provides very simple and straightforward methods to create the paintings in their raw form. So I hope this has been an interesting video for you and that you've gained a few little tools or tricks that you might be able to apply. Once again, if you want to learn about these things in more detail, there are those links in the description. And of course, make sure to go vote on the theme of the next tutorial by clicking on the link in the description. Thanks for joining, ladies and gentlemen, and until next time, I'll see you later.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to my channel to see new content every week. Check out more of my stuff by clicking the annotations over there. You can get the reference files for this tutorial by clicking the link in the description, and if you want the reference files for all the tutorials I've ever made, check out the tutorial archive. If you're looking for a great place to collaborate, explore, or share your own content, head over to newgrounds.com. That's it for now, and until next time, see you later.